Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from the Society for Implementation Science in Nutrition. My name is Eva Monterosa, and I'm SISN's Secretary-Treasurer, and it's a pleasure to be the moderator for today's discussion. I'm joined by our colleague from the Partnership Broker Association, which is a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to developing professional competencies for those managing the partnering process. Regretfully, one of our guest speakers, Ross Tennyson, is unwell and consequently is unable to participate today. However, Helga van Kampen has kindly agreed to step in and cover all the content in her own presentation. We wish Ross a speedy recovery and thank you, Helga, so much for your willingness to share your experiences and insights on how to build cross-sector partnerships. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. And we will have a Q&A, question and answer session at the end of the presentation, and I will pose as many of your questions as possible to Helga. If you experience any technical issues, please also type your questions in the box and our staff will help you address these. We're also active on Twitter and encourage you to chat and engage with us through our Twitter hashtag, which will appear in the chat box, #InvestInIR. Finally, a recording of the webinar will be available after the session. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Helga van Kampen. Helga has been an independent partnership specialist since 2011, and she supports the global partnerships in building, managing, and reviewing partnership processes. As a cultural anthropologist, she's interested in the social dynamics in complex partnerships, and she focuses on the global issues because she feels strongly that joint efforts are needed to address these issues. Helga supports professionals in the how of collaboration, and she has worked with a wide variety of organizations from different sectors such as governments, UN organizations, NGOs, and businesses, including working with us at SISN. Helga further co-developed the Partnership Learning Loop, which is an innovative tool to assess the partnership process, because she believes that the well-being of the collaboration itself affects the results of joint programs. Helga is an accredited partnership broker and an associate, trainer, and mentor for the Partnership Broker Association. So over to you, Helga.
Thank you very much, Eva, for this great introduction. Thank you to all who are listening. The webinar is going to be about what do we mean with partnership, what is partnership brokering, insights and lessons from the partnership brokering in the Implementation Science Initiative. And there's a little bit about knowledge brokering and partnership brokering because there seem to be a bit of parallels. So we're going to explore that too. So what can you expect to get at the end of this presentation is to have an understanding of some of the partnering frameworks and the concept of partnership brokering. Also to have gained insights in lessons from the SISN and 3IE Multi-Stakeholders Implementations Initiative in Uganda and Kenya, and I'll talk more about that later. And gain some insights in how partnership brokering can strengthen the role of the knowledge broker. So, some partnering frameworks, and I'd like to start with what actually is a partnership. It's hard to generally partner if you have very different ideas in your head about what partnership actually means, what it is. When you are suspicious, anxious about each other's motives, reputations, values, or you have a very different idea in mind about, what a partnership really entails, it can be really hard to start a partnership. So I like to introduce to you a couple of frameworks that can be helpful in partnership, working in partnerships. They can be helpful also to explore with your partners. So I like to start with what does the term partnership actually mean to us? And this relates to your mental models. We all have mental models. So we have something in mind, a picture in mind. It actually decides almost how you act in a partnership. So this first one, it's a handshake. It's a business deal. A partnership can also be seen as like a financial transaction. So if you come in with that mental model, it also makes you act in a particular way. It can be seen as a fair deal. You both want to make the best out of it. It could be seen as a collaborative effort. It could be seen as extremely time consuming, busy, many meetings, a lot of extra efforts to pay. It also could be seen as a co-designing process, or perhaps as a power struggle. And this doesn't necessarily need to be something negative. It also could be, disruption that is needed to create innovation. But how we think about partnerships, our mental models, set the tone for what a partnership becomes. So it can be very helpful to discuss upfront with your partner. So how do you see? What do we expect from this partnership? If we look at the definition of a partnership, if we look up a definition in a dictionary, it says an ongoing working relationship where risks and benefits are shared. Signing an agreement to partner is relatively straightforward, but partnering effectively is significantly more challenging than those who sign up a partnership often realize. If we talk about risks being shared, very often we see in partnerships that risks are transferred to one of the partners, for instance, and benefits being shared is also not as straightforward as it looks like. So according to this definition, it's probably true that these features are what distinguish a partnership from other forms of collaboration. But for partnerships to achieve the kind of goals we all hope for, this definition may be a little bit too simplistic. What we see is that partnerships often do not explore what they have in mind when discussing a partnership, and may end up with both a very different picture and linked set of expectations in mind. So the one question was already on the screen, but these questions may be prompting some thoughts for you. To what extent do your partnerships conform to this definition? Have your partners discussed the term and or agreed the definition? Do you use definitions? Maybe you have made your own. So any thoughts on that? You're very welcome to share input on in the chat box, and also if you have questions about it. What we see is that if you discuss the definition up front with your partners, it could be very helpful to get a broader understanding and a deeper understanding of what the partnership becomes, how the partners perceive it. This is another framework that I like to share. We call it the partnering cycle. This cycle provides very useful framework to navigate a partnership over time. Working through a project cycle as a way of building and tracking a program of work is familiar territory, I suppose, for most of you. But in a partnership, something more is required. The starting phase of a partnership may have a very different energy, and the partners may have different needs from, for instance, the managing and maintaining phase, the red blocks that you see down here. Also, the needs and interests may change again, over time when you review or revise a partnership, or when you maybe finalize a partnership. We usually don't say like an exit strategy. We call it like moving on, because the gray blocks are the last part of the partnership. And these the four phases in a partnership, we call it a cycle. It's obviously not a linear process, but it provides a framework to navigate the partnership over time, specifically because the needs of the partners change, and to navigate that is a crucial thing to do in a partnership. Also, there's a number of roles and tasks required in each phase of the partnership. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when I'll talk about the role of the broker. But just to give you an idea, what the partnership broker, I'll talk more about that later, but what they need to pay attention of. So for instance, scoping and building, important to know, to scope the partnership's potential. We see many times partnership, they settle for good enough. And sometimes good enough is good enough, but sometimes it could be really helpful to scope all the potential, to explore explore drivers, expectations, underlying interests of partners, embedding key partnering principles. Well, I'm not going to go through all the tasks one by one, but each phase is characterized by a number of tasks that need to happen and roles that need to be carried out. And what we see in partnerships is that partners rotate and they take on some of these roles, but also sometimes roles and tasks are, they fall between the cracks. There's missed opportunities. And the roles and tasks that are needed in each phase of the cycle, they differ also a lot. So scoping and building is much more about scoping potential, exploring what is possible. It's very often there's a lot of energy enabling partners to differentiate between their partnership and its projects. Whereas managing and maintaining, it's much more about, building structures, helping partners to create further engagement in their organization, building capacity, because sometimes organizations perhaps are not really fit for partnering, and their structures and rules and regulations do not support partnering. So there's a lot about that. And each phase has particular roles, so to say. Well, this is another framework that could be interesting to consider. And I wonder if you've looked at it this way. Partnering can also be seen as some sort of continuum. You have very transactional relationships, and at the other end of the continuum, very collaborative relationships. Transactional relationships, they characterize themselves by service contracts, linear, one-way accountability. Very often it's funding relationships. It's transferring risks. If you think back about the definition that was on screen a couple of slides ago, it was about sharing risk. Well, these transactional relationships, they characterize themselves much more as transferring risks. And if you look at the collaborative relationships, it's much more about co-created activities, mutual accountability. Very often they're characterized by layered relationships. There may be steering groups, program groups, working groups between the partners, and shared risks. The one is not better than the other. In some cases, transactional relationships are very fit for purpose, because you can imagine that collaborative relationships take much more time. They're more time consuming. And sometimes it's much easier to have a very clear cut, a contract, and have more transactional relationships. So it's quite likely that partnerships, they move either into more collaborative or more transactional. They move on this spectrum. Maybe you can do some thinking around, where do your partnerships sit at the moment? So if you take one particular partnership in mind, where does it sit? And is it sitting at the right space? And is there anything needed to either move it more to collaborative side or more to the transactional side? I also like to talk about some of the common partnering challenges and key principles. And I like to start with a question. What, in your experience so far, gets in the way of your partnerships working effectively? There's many things that get in the way of partnerships, but if we look at a lot of global partnerships, we see that there's a couple of challenges that we almost always see appearing. It's not the only ones, but I thought I'll share them, and you may recognize some of them. The first one, a common partnering challenge, is power imbalance. Power comes in many forms and is a valid aspiration for those who feel powerless. But very often, power imbalances, they can hold back potential of a partnership. And if you look at this cartoon, the big person, very often partners think the big person is the person with the biggest bag of money or with the biggest mouth. Power actually is a perception very often. We've asked people in the field sometimes, or in a partnership, so who is the big guy, who's the small guy? And it's interesting that in different settings, the big guy can be a very different thing. So in one setting, it could be, for instance, a CEO of a corporate company. And in another setting, it could be the government. So it depends a lot on the context, but also on the perception in a partnership. Sometimes partners may even think the other one is the powerful person. What we've seen is that equity is incredibly important. So equity around the table is incredibly important to to get the best out of a partnership. A partnership in which some of the partners are or feel marginalized has serious problems that need to be addressed. And equity is built by truly respecting the views, attributes, and contributions of all those involved. So, for instance, what we see a lot is even around a table with 6 partners or 4 partners, if there's one person talking a lot and taking up a lot of time, it may be an indication of a power imbalance. So it's important to make sure that all the voices around the table are heard equally and that there's time for everybody to speak. This is just a small example. So this is one of the challenges. Another challenge that we see a lot is anxiety about difference. Well, many go into partnerships with real anxieties about how possible it will be to work with those operating in different sectors, with different countries. And they fear that difference of view will quickly lead to divergence, conflict, and even like relationship breakdown. A commitment to explore each other's motivations, values, and underlying interests will build understanding and appreciation of the added value that comes from diversity. So, valuing diversity and allowing space for people to explore that diversity is an incredible important principle in partnerships. Another common partnering challenge is hidden agendas. Where the principle is openness, and that's something that sounds very sort of easy and logical, but partnerships quickly get stuck where there are or are perceived to be hidden agendas. And there's a difference between information that needs to be confidential for commercial or legal reasons and information that has a bearing on the partnership and is intentionally kept secret. So sometimes you cannot share everything, but you can at least agree to what you do share with each other, and to explore um, what the reasons are behind something. So whilst trust is not necessarily a precondition for partnering, it's an important aspiration. This is especially true where doing things differently is seen as a high risk. Another common partnering challenge is competing interests, and we see that a lot. Competitiveness seems to be the modus operandi for many, particularly for those working in the same sector, and this can easily become highly destructive in partnerships. Agreeing to explore and build on the added value of collaboration and understanding the right of all partners to gain from their engagement in the partnership is an important starting point to build commitment to the shared goals. And this is an interesting thing that somehow I see in the partnerships that I see is growing. Initially, like 10 years back, partners very often entered a partnership because they wanted to gain something. And somehow I see that there's a growing understanding of that it's important for all the partners, that there's mutual benefit. If there's no benefit for one partner, it's very likely that that partner will disengage. So sometimes it's very helpful to just ask, hey, does everybody still get enough out of this partnership? And then the last challenge that I like to share is uncertainty. Well, again, like perhaps the only thing that all partners have in common at the start of a partnership is their uncertainty about each other, about the partnership itself, and what it will demand from them. Very often we don't know that when we enter a partnership. Well, even a well-planned and prepared partnership has many unknowns in relation to the complex issues it seeks to address that require partners to be bold rather than tentative if they are to achieve breakthrough results. The principle that is what is needed here is courage. Somehow we all like to find simple solutions, quick solutions. We want to know the next step. We want to have answers. And very often in our complex world, and definitely in complex partnerships, this a level of uncertainty is something we need to be able to deal with and to accept to a certain extent. And sometimes, yeah, you need to be courageous to embrace that uncertainty rather than to reject it. Again, these are just 5 principles that we use a lot in the Partnership Brokers Association. There are more. There may be even context-specific ones for your partnerships. But why do we feel these principles matter? Well, diversity matters because it leads to new value. And what I see a lot in partnerships is that, if you look at proposals, the complementarity is stressed. But in real life, it's very hard to deal with diversity. People are very convinced about their own approaches, their own ways. So really embracing diversity, being able to almost capitalize on that, it leads to new value. Equity is an important principle because it leads to respect. Openness leads to trust, and trust, I find that a difficult word because trust is not just something that is there or not there. You can build trust by being open, by making sure that you meet your agreements, that you live up to agreements. That's a way to build trust. Mutual benefit leads to further commitment. If you don't gain enough, then you highly likely disengage. And courage is needed to lead to breakthrough results. Again, a question from me. Are there any other core principles based on your partnership work that you feel are important? If you have any thoughts, please share them in the chat box. This is the introduction on partnership brokering. Partnering is always a kind of a journey with a number of options and routes to a desired destination. We see the partnership process manager, whom we term the partnership broker, as an accomplished and active go-between who helps partners to navigate their partnering journey by assisting them in co-creating a map, planning the most appropriate route, choosing their mode of transport, and knowing when a change of direction is necessary. This term partnership brokering is increasingly used across the globe, but it can be problematic in certain contexts because of certain negative connotations associated with the word broker. So sometimes people also use, for instance, process manager or change leader, intermediary, a bridge builder, animator. Well, there's different words to use. There are many circumstances where someone takes on the role of a partnership broker informally, driven by a strong sense of what is needed for the partnership to work, stepping up to take on typical brokering tasks and roles, out of experience or often just gut feeling. You don't have to be called a partnership broker to be one, but there is, in our view at least, a strong case for defining and acknowledging that role. Those operating in partnership brokering roles, whether formally or informally, need to have or to know when to access from others a range of professional skills and personal attributes to be successful. And the skillful management of partnership collaborative processes is very essential if we are to create collaborative approaches that will lead to an inclusive and sustainable world. So those operating in this role can find themselves brokering any or all of the following. They can broker ideas, complex relations, opportunities, evolution, new approaches, knowledge. And I know some of you may be functioning as a knowledge broker, and I think there's a lot of parallels between partnership broker and knowledge brokers. So it can be different things. It doesn't only need to be relationships. It doesn't only need to be knowledge. It can be different things. What we also see is that a partnership broker can be an internal person who is an internal individual who helps to prepare their organization to be effective partners by negotiating partnerships, maintaining and managing the partnership arrangements, or tracking the partnership's impact. Very often and frequently, it is undertaken by an individual working from within one of the partner organizations. And these can be best described as internal partnership brokers. Their focus is therefore twofold. They operate in the name of their own organization, but they also take on a larger remit on behalf of the partnership. The advantage of a partnership having the support of an internal broker is that this person is likely to be there longer, familiar with the culture, with the aspirations of the partners, as well as the operating context. So they know a lot about, the context the partnership is working in. An internal broker is most likely to bring about incremental changes within the system. But there's also a growing number of external partnership brokers. These are very often independent specialists with a combination of professional skill set and attributes. And they can be called in for specific purposes, for instance, for a review or for a difficult session or light touch in particular phases of the partnership, maybe help building an agreement or management structure. Very often it's an independent with particular skill set. So sometimes it's a combination, so internal broker together with an external broker, and both have their advantages and disadvantages. Partnership brokers often juggle contradictions. At the one hand, they support and serve, whereas at the other hand, they sometimes help partners shape direction and disrupt sometimes, whereas at the other moment, the partnership broker's role is to consolidate. Sometimes brokers work from intuitive insights, and at the other moment, they work from logical deduction. Sometimes the partnership broker is very neutral, unaligned, whereas at another moment, it's needed to be passionate and persistent, building a level playing field at the one hand, or promoting new leadership. So there's a lot of almost contradictory roles to play as a broker, and it depends a lot on what is needed in a partnership. So we sometimes call partnership brokering an art because it has to do with insights, imagination, feeling, just vision, being able to see what is not there yet but may be in the future. And if you look at the picture, it's a great painting of Magritte. He sees an egg and he paints a bird. And that's sometimes what is needed. Because sometimes the partners are so stuck in the middle of figuring out, who wants what, that longer term, more distance, helping to draw that out vision could be is a very important element and the art side of brokering. People skills, understanding, what people need, being empathetic sometimes, being tough sometimes, active listening, not listening to be smart, but listening to really understand and try to help partners understand each other better. Personal engagement. These are some of the characteristics of the art side of brokering. But that's not the only side. It's also science. You need to be analytical, sometimes understand the path in order to make next steps possible. Administrative and technical skills, that's also a very particular skill in partnerships, because how do you, what sort of meeting minute formats do you use? How do you how do you keep all the notes and all the information about a partnership? Do you use the contract of one partner, or do you co-create a contract? Well, all these administrative and technical skills are also very essential. Precise speaking, using some words or not that are really helpful for the partnership, and professional detachment, being able to, move yourself a little bit away from the hectic daily hustle and bustle of a partnership. Some key attributes and skills: empathy, ability to understand the perspective of others, negotiation, facilitation, communication skills, presentation skills, coaching, reviewing, clarity of purpose, letting go. So there's a lot of skills and attributes that we see are essential for making partnerships work, that are essential to bring in as broker. So maybe a question to consider and to chew on a little bit is, how do these concepts and frameworks relate to your partnerships? So the last part of this presentation is to share some of the lessons from the implementation science initiative from SISN and 3IE. I'll just start with a very brief description of this initiative. 3IE and SISN have partnered to improve the implementation and scaling up of anemia control programs for women in Kenya and Uganda through the ISI, the Implementation Science Initiative. This initiative seeks to apply implementation science principles and create a galvanized coalition of policymakers, program actors, and researchers in each of these two countries in order to strengthen anemia control programs during implementation. The ISI also provides the opportunity to learn how to build capacity and practice of implementation science through a facilitated process of learning by doing. So that is like a partnership between two organizations, 3IE and SISN. And the aim is to improve the implementation and scaling up of anemia control programs and to apply implementation science principles and to create a multi-stakeholder coalition. Also to provide an opportunity to learn how to build capacity for and practice of implementation science through a facilitated process of learning by doing. The initiative runs in 2018 and 2019, and there was a kickoff workshop in Kampala for the core teams just before the summer. There were also some scoping visits in January and February. I was asked as a broker to help facilitate the kickoff workshop in Kampala and to help partnership brokers in the countries to build some capacity on the brokering function, but also to help them understand, their role a little bit better. But when I started this support for SISN and 3IE, it became quite clear to me that this partnership, as many other partnerships, was very multi-layered. So, and all layers need care. So in this case, there was the layer of SISN and 3IE. There was the layer of the lead core team in the countries and the implementing partner. There was the layer of the core team in Kenya and Uganda. And there was the layer of in-country partners in Kenya and Uganda. The core teams were created to achieve the objectives of these initiatives, which included identify implementation bottlenecks in the local program, facilitate the access to and utilization of existing knowledge to address challenges when possible, conduct implementation research, facilitate capacity building, cultivate interest in implementation science and implementation research within the country's larger nutrition community. So when these core teams were created, the NGOs worked intensively to develop a draft proposal leading to a sub-grant to carry out their approach. The expected workshop outcomes were the following: the core team to get to know each other better, because this whole structure that you see here, all the partners didn't know each other at the start. They were not quite sure, what the core team was about to do. And also SISN and 3IE were trying to figure out, how they would see this program to work. And they had very different views on how they saw this program as well. So there were lots of different sort of needs that I signaled. And so the first thing was to really help SISN and 3IE to figure out what their partnership was about. they were not quite clear on that. I mean, they were quite clear on the content and what they wanted to happen in the countries, but how to do that. What I discovered, for instance, is 3IE, they needed good quality proposals. They were the lead organization to the back donor, and they wanted to have good quality proposals. SISN needed to create broad understanding of the implementation science initiative, a new concept for many that requires flexibility in the proposals. So these two needs were already almost conflicting with each other, and it created quite some tension between those two organizations. But when exploring what it was all about, it became more clear that both needs were actually very realistic. The lead in the country, which was a local NGO or a national NGO, I should say, they needed clarity on what the initiative was about and what was required. And the core team needed understanding on what the initiative was about and what their role would be. So all these different layers had different understanding of the program, and to create more common understanding on what this program was about, that perhaps was the first step, helping 3IE and SISN to figure out how they would relate together and how their individual needs got enough attention, was also an important step in this process. So another thing that we learned, I guess, is a lot of materials were created in consultation, obviously, with the different partners, but they were not necessarily co-created. So when we were at the workshop in Kampala, all the stakeholders were around the table. So the stakeholders from Uganda, from Kenya, which was like the lead partner, but also the Ministry of Health from both countries. There were not researchers involved, so all the partners were around the table. But we figured after one day that for them, implementation science was not very clear. And although a lot had been developed, a lot of materials had been developed to help to create a broader understanding, at the end of the day, there was a question from a participant. And the question was, so what is implementation science and how different is it from what we already do? So we did like a quick brainstorm and asked them, so how do you see implementation science based on all the things you heard so far and based on your own understanding? And this is what the group came up with. They said, well, it's actually not one methodology. It's about creating evidence on the how and how to scale. It's about organic understanding. So a lot of things came up. They actually sort of try to phrase themselves what they understood with implementation science. And then we took it further, all this input, in shaping this input into new materials based on the group input. And so this is where the group came up with. They said, well, implementation science and implementation research and the process within IS Implementation Science Initiative is that we always start with a bottleneck inventory, which is a very practical but very systematic way of making an inventory of what are the bottlenecks in implementing programs. What do we come across? And in one situation, it can be a mother that doesn't have access to medical aid. The other context, it can be that perhaps people don't consider it a serious problem. So there can be lots of bottlenecks, but doing a very systematic bottleneck inventory, that's key of implementation science. Once we have, once they have made the inventory, they immediately check, is there already existing knowledge? Mobilize existing knowledge. Is there already research on this bottleneck? Can we use this existing research? If not, what new research would be needed? Implementation research, that's what we call it. And then after implementation research is done, facilitate knowledge exchange about all the insights that we gathered. So this all together is implementation science. So it's existing knowledge and implementation research and the bottleneck inventory. And this is where the group came up with. And then all of a sudden, because it was co-created, it helped them understand. We also spent some time on, what does it mean to be a partnership and how can we use strengths good enough? So shaping diverse team already on the international level between 3IE and SISN, there were people involved, and both people bring, or the people that were involved bring additional sort of additional value to this partnership. So help partners to find out what their team roles are, what the preferred team roles are that members play, and build on that. If you, for instance, have a lot of similar people in one team, that may block progress. So building on each other's strengths. So we did an exercise to figure out what are the preferred team roles of the people in the core teams in the countries. And also help team members to appreciate each other's contributions and team roles. That I think was also a very helpful thing to do in the workshop, and it was appreciated a lot. And people recognized also, oh yeah, actually I'm always shaping, and oh actually I'm really like a coordinator, and it helped really to establish a way of working together. So this is the last slide. It's on knowledge brokers and how can partnership brokering support knowledge broker. If I look at and hear from the people within SISN and 3IE about knowledge brokers, there is sort of a categorization or different tasks associated with a knowledge broker. Knowledge brokers are sometimes knowledge managers, linking agents, they need to do capacity building, they are facilitators, they are evaluators. So it's also a lot of roles that knowledge brokers play. So shifting between roles, but also understanding perhaps the different dynamics in partnerships could really strengthen the role of a knowledge broker. I've talked a long time, so maybe we could start the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helga. That was a fascinating presentation. So right now we open it for Q&A. We haven't received that many questions, and I'm sure people have a lot of questions. So please go ahead and put them into the question and answer box, not in the chat box, so that I can see them as they come up. We do have one question from Bridget Adam. Hi, Bridget. Thanks for joining the webinar. And her question is, why is there a need for professional detachment in partnership brokering?
That is a great question. What we see a lot is that working in partnerships can be quite dynamic and intense. And in the intensity, sometimes decisions are taken based on the moment and based on emotions, based on very short-term needs. And sometimes it can be very helpful to have somebody in the room that just steps out of that starts observing, that starts to map stuff, that starts to capture the different things that people feel passionate about, and build on these building blocks rather than, adding another voice, I would say. I don't know if that makes sense.
So it's more about taking a little bit of an outside or neutral stance rather than digging in more into your professional position or the position of your institution, for example, and allowing that brokering to take place.
Yeah, and especially because very often, if you're partnering, you carry the interests and of your own organization needs, and you carry the interest of the partnership. And sometimes people get locked into the interest of their organization. Sometimes, so that balancing act is already quite a hard thing. So to be able to step back, we sometimes, for instance, use observers. Just have somebody who observes, and that already can bring in a very fresh perspective in the crucial key elements to help the partnership move forward. But thank you, it's a great question.
Indeed. And Bridget says, thank you, that was helpful. So good. Are other questions or comments that you'd like to share? Just put them into the chat box. And while others maybe type their questions in, Helga, I had jotted down a few questions as I heard your presentation. And one of them was you when you talked about the knowledge brokers and the partnership brokers, some of the ways they overlapped were particularly in the knowledge and idea exchanges. So can you speak a little bit more about how you see the differences between a partner broker and a knowledge broker, other than the fact that the knowledge broker is probably providing more technical assistance or technical knowledge than a partnership broker might do?
Yeah, actually, I was thinking about that myself too, and I haven't done like a huge research in the. Before I started working with SISN, I wasn't even aware of knowledge brokers, so that in itself is already interesting. I see a lot of similarities in. Well, if we look at this slide again, in for instance being a linking pin, a capacity builder, and being that you need to shift hats all the time. But what I think I also notice is that a knowledge brokering focuses very much on the knowledge exchange, and perhaps a little less on the relational aspects of the knowledge, what knowledge brokering entails. So there I perhaps see a little bit of difference. I also don't know if knowledge brokering is seen in a cycle or something, or if that's just something ongoing. But I don't have a lot of knowledge on the knowledge broker. I think these are two things that perhaps are most spring to mind for me.
Right, so that the knowledge broker is much more focused on the technical and providing that assistance and facilitating that knowledge exchange. And the
Yeah.
partnership broker really focusing on that relational element of how do partners interact, and all the principles that you talked about, the openness, the equity, the diversity,
Yeah, and
etc.
to steer on that as well, to steer on that. And perhaps another thing, but I don't know. I mean, for a broker, sometimes, I mean, I was just like involved in a huge humanitarian partnership, and I mean, it was a very difficult dynamic partnership. And for them to step out and help to, shape direction, for instance, I'm not quite sure if knowledge brokers do that, but to really help partners to shape new direction, or to help partners to decide what the next step is. I'm not sure if knowledge brokers do that. Maybe they do, but that's very particular things for a partnership broker, I suppose.
Okay, so a few more questions are coming in, Helga. Thank you for that reply. One question from Lola Costello saying, do you feel that the brokering role had more benefit at certain layers of the partnership, or did it help all layers equally? And I think she was referring to the ISI activity that you just participated in.
That's very interesting, because the assumption when we started was that that we would particularly play a role in the countries. And but when we started, when we sort of looked at the layers in the partnership, we realized that there was some dynamics between 3IE and SISN that perhaps blocked progress on the ground. So that's why we started, basically, to figure out, okay, what's going on here? What do you need? What is it that is needed to help progress? So that particular, I guess, intervention was very helpful to to create progress in the countries. So that I found a very particular, the first intervention, basically. But then at country level also help partners understand and also voice unclarities, for instance. I don't know if this is an answer to the question, Lola.
I hope so. So I think maybe just to clarify then that it just depends on the needs of each of these layers, and as you said, they would have different elements that needed support or shaping or facilitating.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Sorry.
now, often if you're in a program, you're so focused on the program and the results, and that was also the case here. So, for instance, the partners on the ground, they said, well, we just want to know what we need to do. And SISN said, well, we just want to make sure that we meet the results. And 3IE was saying, we just want to make sure that there's quality proposals. And so it almost were different views rather than finding out how it could all support each other.
Okay, thank you, Helga, for that answer. Another question is coming in from David. David Pelletier, what can be done when there are strong differences and interests in mandates from the partners' organizations, and the people at the table do not have the discretion or authority to modify those?
Cool. That is a very hard question. Very often in partnerships, that's the whole challenge, that there's no clear mandate. Within organizational structures, it's very it's very different because you have mandates. There's a director, there's a management team, there's this, and between partners, all partners are equal. So it's navigating between not having mandates but having a lot of responsibility, I suppose. What we do sometimes see is that actually maybe that's what we see a lot, is that partnerships itself are vehicles for change almost. So the partnerships, they create change in organizations because they demand different ways of working, and that could be on the level of mandates, but it also could be on the level of procedures or formats that you use, or it could be all sorts of things. But the partnerships itself, and I think that's also where it becomes so interesting, they often create change in the organizations that are part of this. And that also sometimes happens on the level of mandate.
Great, Helga, thank you. That's a good reply. So almost that the partners become advocates for change within their organizations to facilitate working through a partnership.
Yeah.
Another question from Abdul Razak Mohammed saying, so the key element, so he has a comment and then a question. First, his comment is, the key element in listening to Helga on Implementation Science Initiative is to use the current knowledge to generate further evidence for enhanced implementation. So his question is, how do we scale up ISI considering how cumbersome it could be?
Well, I think that's what this whole initiative is about, to really learn how it works and to really capture learnings. So, I think that's it's an experiment in itself to work this way, and I think it's been captured very, very very well, and hopefully that creates new insights. But maybe somebody from SISN is better placed to answer that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know much exactly about what's going on behind the scenes with the partnership, so I can't really answer to that question, Abdul. But I'm sure if you stay tuned, you'll learn more about how this initiative is working out and shaping up, and whether or not, and we are trying to do this at scale in the sense that it is happening within programs that are implemented at scale. I guess the question is, how does one replicate this across different countries who are probably sharing similar challenges? So I think, yeah, that's something to keep a lookout for the lessons learned.
What I understood, Eva, sorry to interrupt, but what I understood is that the idea is really to share these lessons and to replicate it.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. All right, so we're nearing the end of our webinar. It's 6:30 here in the Eastern Europe time zone. So I would like to thank again Helga for this great presentation and for your insightful answers to these interesting questions. We hope that this webinar has been informative and thought-provoking. And if you have any other questions or ideas for upcoming webinars, please contact the Society at comms@implementnutrition.org. Do visit our website to stay up to date on the Society's activities and learn more about implementation science in nutrition and various engagement opportunities that are available to our members. We're also active on social media, and we welcome your thoughts and comments and engagement through Twitter and LinkedIn page. So once you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a very brief survey, and we would appreciate if you would take a moment to provide your feedback on the webinar itself. You will also receive a follow-up email in a few weeks with a link to today's webinar recording and a URL to the PDF of the slides. So on behalf of SISN and our presenter, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of the day. Thank you, Helga. Bye-bye.